Well, I don't know about inspiration. I'll try and inspire you this morning. Thank you all for coming. And it always surprises me when I give talks on Algeria, so many people are there, because basically Algeria is not really in the centre of the world news for lots of reasons. It doesn't really get that much coverage, so I'm always surprised when you turn out. So wonderful to see you all. And I'll just preface my remarks in case you get the wrong impression from what I say. All my PC correctness or non-PC correctness and so forth. In spite of what I may say, I do love Algeria passionately. I love the people. I regard it as my second home. So you may think that a bit odd when you hear what I've got to say about it, but there you are. Let me put my specs on so I can see these notes. I haven't seen these slides, actually. I bashed them out a few days ago, and this is the first time I've seen them, so I hope I've said the right things. Okay. I'm just going back a little tiny bit in history, really, for some of you who are not familiar with it. How did Algeria get into, the situation it's in today? By that, an illegitimate president, that's the Algerian people's view of him, or most Algerian people's view of him, a power struggle going on within the army, which I'll talk about, which is not being publicised and not many people are aware of. And, you might say there's nothing new about that in Algeria, and it is rather familiar. And a continuing popular resistance to the regime, demanding a second republic, in other words, major change. Okay. Just to run through the background a little bit, what I'm going to talk about to begin with briefly is, and this is ready to refresh you, Bouteflika's attempt for a fifth term, which really sort of triggered off the present crisis. The rise, or not the rise, but the takeover really of power by Ahmed Qaid Salah, the head of the army, who is now dead, so he's died just recently, rather unexpectedly. And the Hirak. The Hirak is the really Arabic word for the popular resistance movement. So the takeover, on the one hand by Qaid Salah, and secondly by the Hirak. These two sort of political forces have really emerged in the last year. That moves on to the enforced election in December, enforced by Qaid Salah. I'll talk about it briefly. And the winner of that, Abdelmajid Tebboune, how he actually won, which is really rather intriguing, and it rather colours the serious questions of what he's going to do now and where things are going, which relates to this question of who actually rules Algeria, which has always been a bit of a mystery. That links into Qaid Salah's rather unexpected death in the middle of all this, just after the election, and the big question of whether Tebboune can resolve the political and economic crisis. The key questions, which I'm going to come on to after I've given you a little bit of history, is how he will respond, Tebboune that is, to the Hirak with their weekly protests, which have now gone on for a year, in fact February the 22nd, so this is their 52nd week. Will he engage in dialogue, and if so, with whom? Will the Hirak weaken and dissipate following an escalation of repression, which I'll talk about, or will it intensify as its determination to forge a second republic sort of carries on, and so forth? I'll talk a little bit about the economy in 2020 as sort of fairly ambitious plans, a bit pie in the sky, I think, have given way to sort of emergency measures, which is a bit nearer to reality. The question of whether the scrapping of the 51-49% investment law will entice foreign investors, which may be important to some of you. And finally, the question of whether the new Hydrocarbons Law will resolve the hydrocarbon sector's many problems. Okay, this is probably familiar to you, so I'll just whistle through it. Bouteflika's fifth term, the tension that we've got now in the country, really all through 2018, began with the whole question of the Bouteflika clan and between the Bouteflika clan and Qaid Salah. And the question was really, this question of a fifth term, would Bouteflika, who's mentally very ill and not capable of running the country, hasn't been for a long time, would he stand for a fifth term? Qaid Salah himself, I say, emphasise he's just died, but he was the power behind all this for the last 12 months. He was very loyal to Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the president, for reasons I haven't time to go into, but he basically loathed the younger brother, Saïd Bouteflika, who effectively was running the country when his elder brother was so ill. And Qaid Salah later referred to Said Bouteflika and the clan around him as the Isaba, the gang. So this word has become very prominent with sort of criminal intonations in the last few months. So the Isaba is the whole gang, the Bouteflika sort of clan. Tension really began over the presidential election in spring 2019. Would Bouteflika stand? And prior to that, when it was a bit of an unknown question, Qaid Salah, through 2018, undertook quite a purge of the army, putting his men in most of the key positions and getting rid of many of the more Bouteflika-orientated generals. Okay, the question of Qaid Salah and the Hirak takeover. In 10th of February, the Bouteflika clan announced that he was going to stand for a fifth term. This triggered massive public anger, and on the 22nd of February, a year ago this week, the Hirak sort of took to the streets in their millions. Figures are a bit, we can't really measure them, but many local reports reckon that as many as 15 million were out around the country. Some put it to 20. I think that really is a bit high, but it's pretty massive when you think of it. That's in all cities across the country. On the 8th of March, the Bouteflika clan said he wouldn't stand for office, but he would remain in office, if you like, so he was going to hang around as president to oversee reforms, something which was never really very likely. That, of course, was unacceptable to the Hirak. In the meantime, around this time, 26th of March, Qaid Salah appears to be siding with the people in the Hirak, or he's making statements to that effect, and he calls for the implementation of Article 102, which is the removal of the presidency on health grounds, etc., which was enacted. There was a few days between those, around the end of March, during which time Said Bouteflika, the younger brother, Medien, the former head of the intelligence service, Tatag, the new intelligence chief, they were sort of plotting, is a long word, but to find some alternative to what Qaid Salah was wanting to do. And they approached the former president, Zeroual. This went on over a weekend. Qaid Salah heard about it, and that was the end of that. On the 2nd of April, Qaid Salah demanded Article 102. That was followed, and Bouteflika resigned. Following day, 2 days later, Said Bouteflika, Medien, Tatag, and a few others were arrested, banged up in jail. And Qaid Salah effectively became the undisputed strongman, effective ruler of the country, from then on. So from about April last year up until a couple of months ago, the death of Qaid Salah, the politics was really Qaid Salah versus the Hirak and what was going on really between them. The election was postponed to July the 4th, and cancelled because there were no candidates prepared to stand. This is due to the force of the Hirak. Then in September, Qaid Salah, more or less losing patience, ordered an election. So there will be an election on the 12th of December, which took place. The Hirak rejected this, and all their demonstrations each week were against that. As usual, the election was rigged. I won't go into the reason why Algerian elections are rigged in Algeria. It's basically to make sure it has the veneer of democracy, but in fact the army's man is put in power. The official turnout was 39.3. Usually the official turnout's normally 300% bigger than the real turnout. In fact, all the estimates on the ground, which I think are pretty accurate now, show that about 8% of the public voted. In other words, there was virtually a total boycott, hence the notion of an illegitimate president. Okay, there were 5 candidates, all more or less approved by the regime. The initial favourite was Tebboune, who we now know has won. He was chosen by Qaid Salah. They were quite close friends, and Qaid Salah initially wanted Tebboune in as president. This is going back into sort of September time. But Tebboune was very quickly rubbished in the media, particularly by a media group called Anaha. We'll explain why in a moment. And the former culture minister, Azzedine Mahoubi, who was head of the R&D and other government-supporting political party, was the hot favourite. In advance, I should say, Mahoubi, a very weak man, had homosexual known tendencies, etc., which in a Muslim country means he's wide open to blackmail and manipulation and so forth. There's a long history of that in Algerian politics, by the way, for that reason of... Anyhow, we'll come back to him. And the winner, of course, is selected by the army, not the electorate. That's just the veneer that goes on. On election day itself, Innaha, and we'll talk about Innaha in a moment, even right up to midday was saying that Mahoubi was ahead and winning. At that moment, according to my sources, which I think are pretty good, Qaid Saleh asked what was going on, because he had already ordered and arranged for Tebboune to win. So suddenly he's seeing the news and it's not going that way. And one of his top generals, Lashkem, who's head of so-called cyber warfare and that sort of stuff, explained to Qaid Saleh that his head of domestic internal security, a general called Bouaza Wassini, I tend to refer him as Bouaza, had been plotting to install Mahoubi, the weaker one, not Tebboune. Qaid Saleh, at some point on election day, it could be in the afternoon, immediately ordered Tebboune to be proclaimed the winner. He didn't want a second round, so he said, make sure he's got over 50% of the vote. So Tebboune was declared the winner later that evening, and Bouaza was put under house arrest. We'll come back to that. And in the evening, the official result came out, initially at 64, reduced to 58%, which is a pretty overwhelming sort of thing. I want to talk about this Bouaza plot because it's ongoing, and we Menas, we are the only people who've mentioned this, have talked about it, publicised it in great detail. So you're hearing this for the first time here. If you've heard it before, well, interesting in your sources. Okay, Bouaza comes from Tlemcen, that's the Bouteflika sort of area of patronage, and he had rapid promotion thanks to his Bouteflika links. He was spotted by Qaid Saleh in about 2018, and he sort of switched loyalties from Bouteflika clan to Qaid Saleh. So he was a bit of a mole, we might say, in the Bouteflika camp. In the beginning of 2019, he was appointed as Central Director of Military Infrastructure at the Defence Department, a very, very important position, which we don't hear much about, because it covered all the army contracts. And he was only there for 3 months, but he was dishing out massive contracts to the Chinese. They were more than happy, and they were chucking a lot of money in the wrong direction. To Bouaza, who was passing it on to Qaid Saleh, to the army, corruption of an Algerian scale, which the Chinese were more than happy to indulge in, and the army at the highest levels. Bouaza at this point would probably be ranking 5th, 6th, 7th, somewhere in that area on the hierarchy in the army generals. That's a bit of an estimate there. Okay. In April, he's appointed as head of the internal security, very powerful position, possibly the most powerful in the country, and head of counterintelligence. He also, very importantly, he takes over the personal security of Qaid Saleh, who hitherto had always been protected through the gendarmerie, but that switches from the gendarmerie to the Directorate of Internal Security. So Bouaza is kind of appointing the, what do you call them, the men, the guardians around Qaid Saleh's family, his home, and his personal safety and so forth. That becomes important. Bouaza's plan was to have all the other top generals squeezed out, removed, so he would eventually take over, become the big man, the strong man, ultimately replacing Qaid Saleh. This seems to have been his strategy, and through last year, particularly in his position as head of security, he engineered through devious plots, schemings, lies, the usual sort of stuff, through his position as head of intelligence. He got rid of Mohammed Qaidi, who was technically his boss at the time, Khalid Belkhashir, these are high-powered generals, Othman Maloud and Sharif Zarad. All these top generals were removed rather discreetly in the second half of last year, leaving between Qaid Saleh and Bouaza only Abdelkader Lashkem, who's head of sort of cyber security, i.e., blocking up the internet and stopping scurrilous emails and Twitter accounts about the Algerian regime, and Said Shangria, who is currently has replaced Qaid Saleh as Army Chief of Staff. Bouaza was plotting to remove Lashkem, and he had got quite a long way down the track. I think Lashkem's days were really shortly numbered, and I think that's the reason, I know it is why Lashkem blew the whistle to Qaid Saleh on election day. So when Qaid Saleh said what's going on, Lashkam said, there's a plot by Bouaza, this is what's going on, and so forth. So Qaid Saleh stepped in, ordered Tebboune to be appointed, etc. So Bouaza was trying to get Mahumi elected. He'd done deals with him. He had done deals with various other members of the administration, the Prime Minister, and so on and so forth, and particularly with Anis Rahmani's, his proper name is Mohammed Mokadem. He trades under Anis Rahmani, who is the director of the Anaha group. So that was all the scurrilous information, was part of this plot, which was working very well until the last minute. The other generals, particularly Shangri and a few others, appeared to be aware of the plot and to go along with it. The reason being probably, almost certainly, that they thought, well, they'll benefit out of it too. If Qaid Saleh's moved out, Shangri thinks I'll take over there. The fact that Bouaza was probably plotting for himself, that's irrelevant now because they're dead. But it was that. So the question is, why didn't this strong man who's been running the country right up until a couple of months ago, why was he so, off the pace, so to speak? Why wasn't he aware of all this plotting going on? The reason for this, as we now know, is that Qaid Saleh was seriously ill, and he did die. He was seriously ill, but this was not coming through in the media, it was not being reported. In fact, you can pick up one Defence Ministry report saying he was suffering from severe hypertension. If you dug around a bit deeper, you'd find he was in hospital in Oran for much longer. His doctors had told him to stop travelling and, to take it easy, etc., etc. But the reason he became so seriously ill was something that may come back and bite who don't know. I don't think so in the immediate future. And this is the Bahadine Kliba affair. Bahadine Kliba is he's still alive, he's in jail, is a monstrously large man. 28 stone, somebody told, maybe more. He is absolutely huge. And a lot's been said about that and so forth. Anyhow, he's massively corrupt, and I can't get into all his corrupt details. Basically, he bought himself into as an MP, a deputy in the FLN. He was very influential in that, the ruling party. Basically, he is up to his neck in corruption with Qaid Saleh. Qaid Saleh being the most corrupt person in the military firmament, as the American embassy has long been quoted for saying. When we talk about corruption in Algeria, Qaid Saleh, we're dealing in hundreds of millions, probably more, massive, particularly through his children and various things of their supplying the army with its goods, internal things, commissions on everything under the sun, taking control of a lot of resources in the country through his children's names, etc., etc. Anyhow, Kliba was his sort of partner in much of this stuff. And Bouaza, in his good plotting mode, starts pushing to have Kliba investigated by the Justice Minister, Zegmati, and Bouaza have been working together as the so-called Justice Minister to investigate Kliba. Kliba sort of sees this happening and thinks, it's funny, Qaid Saleh protects me, what's going on? And the penny perhaps drops that he's not being protected by Qaid Saleh. In fact, Qaid Saleh probably was unaware of these investigations. Anyhow, he's brought before, he's a court summons at the beginning of October. Around about the 26th of September, he sees the writing on the wall, flees the country into Tunisia, goes to Malta, a good place if you want to buy a passport to just about anywhere in the world, EU in particular, gets a passport for Ireland and starts setting out making applications to come to this country for political asylum on the grounds that he's an opponent of the regime. The fact he was probably one of the biggest criminals in it is neither here nor there. And he links up with a man called Said Ben Sadira, who lives here in London, and Ben Sadira becomes his sort of spokesman. Ben Sadira was tied up to the former intelligence chief, Medien, so is therefore an enemy of Qaid Saleh, etc., etc. And Ben Sadara starts leaking all this information and threats against the regime, all the crimes that Qaid Saleh has been up to with his children, all this stuff starts pouring out via London during October. And this is really very serious, not just for Qaid Saleh, but to Algeria, because the scale of this is so massive that if this went public, it would really do Algeria a lot of damage. It would completely ruin the reputation of the Algerian army if it hasn't been ruined already. And these threats are there. So Qaid Saleh sort of realizes when he hears all this, and it all came out very quickly in a few days, his number's probably up, and he was in Oran at the time, and the shock of all this, sent him off into hospital where he either had a heart attack or a stroke, or as the army says, high blood pressure and so forth. So through October and November, we know that he was very ill. And I think because of that, his eye was off the ball, and I think he was unaware of the plotting going on around him. Anyhow, he died on the 23rd of December, allegedly of a heart attack. There have been talks about his murder and so forth. I'll just mention that. I don't think it's very relevant, but it's part of the details. Allegedly he died of a heart attack. I don't think an autopsy was undertaken. He was obviously very ill. He'd been appearing to be ill. He'd lost a huge amount of weight in the preceding couple of months when he was, obviously worried by all this. Very interesting. He too has homosexual tendencies, in spite of having 7 children, and he lives in Algiers with his drivers refer to him as his wife. That's Murad. He's just known as Qaid Salah's wife, and Murad was his manservant, etc., companion. He looked after his home in Algiers. Murad was replaced at this time by allegedly saying, I need a few days' leave. Or he was either told to take a few days' leave. By whom? Well, the security of Qaid Salah's house was in the hands of Bouaza. Did Bouaza give this order? Did Murad just want to have a few days' leave? But the point is that the person inside Qaid Salah's house was replaced by someone from the Internal Security Services during the 2 or 3 days prior to his heart attack, which most people don't know about. But of course, when somebody dies in Algeria, there's always rumours of murder, etc. But I think it does leave it a little bit open, because several people certainly would have wanted Qaid Salah's death if he wasn't going to die naturally, which I suspect he was. One of which is Bouaza, who's lingering under house arrest. Of course, the army hierarchy would rather like Qaid Salah out of the way, because the pile-up of this expose of his activities is massive. If he's dead, it's unlikely to really run very far, unlikely to be court trials and so forth. So Qaid Salah's death is something of a game changer, and it really is, particularly with all this plotting behind it, which, what has happened to that? So this comes on to these key questions. Can Tebboune, who came into power under these very strange circumstances, which very few people are aware of, what will he do? Will he be able to resolve the political and the economic crisis? So the key questions, which I've just run through: will he be able to respond to the Hirak, which has gone on for a year? Will he engage in dialogue? If so, with whom? Will the Hirak weaken? What's going to happen with the economy? What's going to be the impact of the investment law changes, if they are in fact changed, which I'll come on to, and so forth. Okay, so after 2 months in power, he was inaugurated pretty well 2 months exactly ago. After 2 months in office, and having during his election campaign said all the right things about everything, saying yes, he's going to talk with the Hirak and look after the Hirak, and they're very noble, very honourable Algerian people. I love Algerian people. One has to remember the Algerian regime would love Algeria if it had no people in it. People are a menace. There are 40 million of them, and the regime would really like to have none of them, because they don't need them, because the oil doesn't need labour, etc., etc. So there is this, big gap between the regime and the people. So he's saying all the nice things about the people, supporting them, etc., etc., etc. And he did so on the day after the election. Since then, I'm pretty nearly 100% certain the word Hirak hasn't even passed his lips. He's been made no mention. In fact, he's doing a wonderful job of sort of pretending they don't exist at all. So his initial strategy has been to ignore the Hirak. He and his generals, which generals, a good question, I'll come back to those in a moment, the army command for what it is at the moment, they're clearly hoping that his sort of talk about reform, and which he's doing a lot, and he's going to make lots of changes, hoping that that will, and such as changing the constitution, etc., 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 some other signals, mostly rather ambivalent, about appeasement, releasing detainees, etc. The hope is this will sort of send the Hirak to sleep, and it will sort of dissipate in strength. I'll come on to whether it has or not in a moment. Okay, will he engage in dialogue? Well, he's spent the last few months talking about dialogue, lots of blah, 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 promises and so forth, promises that Algerians have heard thousands of times over in the last 30 years and never seen delivered. He's been having talks with chosen, selected people, personalities, some in the broad sort of loose opposition area, and not the radical opposition, but the sort of middle-of-the-road opposition, a few other people. But they've all been on a one-to-one basis. They've all been private. No transcripts have been released, etc. So we've no idea what's been said behind those doors. And most of those people are actually deemed irrelevant by the Hirak. They're yesterday's men mostly, and of questionable, political positioning. He said he's going to amend the constitution. That's great. Bouteflika said that and spent 5 years doing nothing. But again, this is the president, an illegitimate president, saying, I'm going to amend the constitution. And this is top-down stuff. The whole thing about the Algerian revolution, if that's what we're going to call it, they want bottom-up, not top-down. And this is just the way the regime has always done things. We will set the agenda and so on and so forth. Okay, he appointed his own chosen team of 15 experts. They just happen to be the heads of sort of constitutional law in most of the universities. Some of them not with much experience actually on this at all, but it looks as if he's brought them all in. But again, he appointed them. I'm not saying that some of them aren't very fine people and would like to amend the constitution, as no doubt he would. It's the way it's being done. This is the problem. It's excluded any representation from the more extreme opposition parties, the ones that count, if you like, and the Hirak. That may change. He may open it up. He says he'll open it up for discussion and so forth. I'm sure he will. He's going to have to. But the point is that it's top-down, not bottom-up. So at the moment, the call from the Hirak is, we don't want it, we're not having it, chuck it out, illegitimate president, put it all in the dustbin. So he's running up against the brick wall there. I think there will be discussions. I think he's going to force to have discussions. There are, in fact, back channels already open with some of the opposition parties who, the more radical ones, the ones that are more serious, that have grouped together as what they call the Pacte Alternative Democratique, the Alternative Democratic Forces parties. This is the FSS and a few other parties. I won't go into the details here. These are some of the more radical opposition parties who are beginning to really be seen as the representatives of the Hirak. Members of those parties are down in the streets demonstrating with them. The Hirak doesn't have any structure. It won't have, because it says if we do, it'll just get put in jail, etc. So they are staying amorphous, if you like, difficult to talk to in that situation. So I think we're going to see probably talks of some sort of merging between the PAD as sort of vague representatives of the Hirak. I think that is likely. I'll be surprised if it doesn't. If it doesn't happen, then there's going to be, I think, big problems. Okay, will the Hirak weaken following the escalation of repression? In spite of all the propaganda, there was quite an interesting intensification of repression immediately after the election. Quite subtle, quite clever. Whose hands were on it? Probably Bouaza. It was the gist of it was to go and hit basically the rural areas, the towns out in the sticks. In other words, not Algiers, Constantine, Oran, going out into Sidi Bel Abbès, Mostaganem, Tiret, all these sort of towns out there, and basically making any sort of demonstration just impossible. And you do that by flooding in, tens of thousands of police, just blocking off these towns. If they want to go to the town square, you just can't get in. If you want to go down the, one or two high streets, you can't. They're blocked off. So you're forced into cafes, smaller groups. There they are arrested, taken to jail for an hour or two, then chucked out again onto the street, and etc. That sort of harassment. But you basically stop public demonstrations in public spaces, which gives the impression, particularly to state television, wow, there's no Hirak, no demonstrations going on in these areas. So you have a lot of propaganda coming out through state media showing these pictures of no demonstrations, these towns, not explaining why, and then saying, well, the numbers are diminishing elsewhere. And some quite interesting things here. The student demonstration, which takes place on a Tuesday after the Friday Hirak demonstration, these two have been running together for a year now. On a couple of Tuesdays ago, all the reports were the numbers were down, students were diminishing, la-di-da-di-da. Yeah, quite right. It didn't say that the reason why the students weren't demonstrating, or a lot of them were, was because it coincided with university exams, and the students had agreed that exams would take priority, otherwise they would, suffer in quite vengeful ways, and they were replaced largely by citizens. So citizens came out and replaced the students on the street. But the media portrayed this, particularly the foreign media too, which just laps up sort of propaganda straight out of the Algerian press services and so on and so forth. So it's very bad, irresponsible reporting by media in Europe. Not that it pays much attention to Algeria, I should say, but what they did say was not very clever. This question of appeasement, most people have said they will refuse to talk to Tebboune until there is appeasement. By appeasement, they mean release all the political detainees, none of which should have been picked up to start with, take the dogs off demonstrations, allow free demonstrations as are technically allowed by the Constitution, free up the press, stop muzzling the press, etc., etc., etc. Well, depending on how you want to read sort of facts, you can argue there has been appeasement, you can argue there hasn't. Just the pattern of what's been happening is, yes, well over 100, probably nearer 200, it's very difficult to count, of people picked up and detained over this period have been released in the last 2 or 3, 4 weeks. But if you look at them, most of them have already been under pre-trial detention in jails. They're picked off the streets, taken before a judge magistrate, slung in jail on pre-trial detention, which international auditors are violently opposed against. So you leave them in jail for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. You then hoik them out, bring them before the judge and say, well, you're guilty of this. 1 year sentence, 6 months suspended. Well, you've already served 6 months, so you're free. Is that a release? You can interpret it how you like. So, a lot of that, well over 100, and several others truncating sentences on a suspended basis and saying, well, you've already served 4 or 5 months in jail, so you're out. So this question of appeasement, you need to look at individual cases. That's been the broad pattern of the appeasement. So these are the sort of ambivalent signals I'm talking about, which raises the question of really, who's got the power on this? Is Tebboune his own man? Is the justice system running the show? Are the generals telling them what to do, as they always have done? And I'll come back to that in a second. So the Hirak is so far really been remaining extremely strong and very determined. It is not going to crumble. Okay, so all the propaganda saying it is, I'm saying it won't. I may be wrong, but that's my analysis at the moment. And certainly knowing quite a lot of the people in it, they've said, look, we've gone too far, we've wasted a year, we're not going to give up. If we give up, it's the end of Algeria. And that is whatever that means. Interestingly enough, in the last month or two, those of you who know Algeria will know the standard form of protest. 10,000 demonstrations a year. Every town in the country has a demonstration for a week over water supply, no electricity, roads haven't been fixed, the sewage hasn't been collected. The usual demonstrations. You block the road, set the tires on fire, whoopsie, tomorrow the municipality will come along and fix it. This is the sort of standard dialogue between the people and the government. Have a little demonstration if you want, the municipality to do its work. Well, in the last 2 months, there's been an upsurge of that all around the fairly deep rural areas where you wouldn't really expect much in the way of political demonstration going on, particularly in the eastern half of the country. And that has really been that uprising, or not uprising, upsurge on the normal pattern of demonstration, if you like, civil unrest, has certainly taken its cue and its courage, if you like, from the Hirak. So there is this interesting link between the Hirak, which are political activists and fairly smart, and, if you like, the deep, more rural country bumpkins, or whatever you want to call them, getting courage and inspiration from the Hirak. That is something to watch. Might it spread? Might it not? I don't know, but it's certainly something that's to be aware of. And you're not going to get this on the news and in the media. It's just not there for the obvious reasons. So sooner or later, Tebboune is going to have to face up to the Hirak. You can't sit around much longer just pretending it's not going on, in spite of repression, security, propaganda, and all the rest of it. And I think the negotiations, if they appear, one hopes they will, because I think it's the only way forward, will be through the PAD and through the back channels which are developing there. So that's the area to watch. The economy, well, there's nothing really much to say about the Algerian economy. Sounds a bit daft, but it's been in crisis since 2014 when the oil price dropped. It's just been deepening progressively, largely because the administration so far has done absolutely nothing. All the economic advice it's had from everybody over generations, diversify, etc., 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 it's just ignored. It's really done an ostrich-like job of keeping its head in the sand, hoping for the oil price to recover and that, things will be back to normal. So basically, the situation is getting worse. It's got much worse in the last year, really, as a result of the political instability, particularly through most of Bouteflika's business chums, the oligarchs, all rabidly corrupt, basically being banged up in jail by Guy Salah initially, so it's going to be interesting what happens on that front now. Ali Haddad and all these sort of people. And they were running, large sort of conglomerates, if you like, on the never, borrowing money out of the bank, laundering it through 24 hours. I mean, it's really ramshackle business. And employing, tens of thousands of people. So suddenly, overnight, they are potentially unemployed. The supply chains are breaking down. I mean, the statistics are quite extraordinary. It's a bit debatable how accurate they are, but we're talking about thousands of businesses closing down, smaller business in the supply chains and so forth. Unemployment, real threatened increasing by another couple of 100,000, probably. Great uncertainty. And some of the emergency measures I talked about are in fact the government stepping in to sort of pick up, if you like, try and resolve this sort of mess of its own creation, if you like, because that could become quite potentially dangerous at a social sort of level. So the economy has got worse there. What is interesting, I have a little bit of faith in the new Prime Minister, Abdelaziz Gerad, who was appointed by Tebboune. So he's been in office under a couple of months now. I think he's potentially a good man. His background is more sort of academically than political, which is possibly a good thing. He's made quite strong statements in favour of the Hirak. So one feels, before he was appointed, he was making statements in the general media last year that one could see as supportive, I think, of at least the aspirations of the Algerian people. He's come out in very strong terms in public, in the APS, in the formal mainstream media in Algeria, as saying that the whole Bouteflika era destroyed the economy, it was complete rubbish, etc., etc., and so much so that, and this comes on to the next point, he said that the budget, the loi de finance, the finance law for this year was put together by a bunch of idiots, Bedoui and these sort of people, all the old regime. They didn't know what they were doing. It's a complete rubbish. It's a nonsense. And he's chucked it in the dustbin. So basically, the loi de finance, the budget for 2020, which is really what we should be addressing now in terms of where the government's going and what it's going to do, is effectively in the dustbin. And he's said that he's going to come out with a supplementary budget as soon as possible. I suspect that may not be until midsummer, but it does, I think, when we see that budget, I think we'll get a far better indication of the policies of the new regime, or the new government, the new administration. As for Tebboune, he's been talking, making wonderful speeches, probably geared to foreign propaganda. People here in London, they had a trade mission over here, and they didn't actually talk much about politics. It's quite interesting. They actually ignored talking about everything of importance. And the few statistics they gave on the economy were a bit dodgy. They were massaged upwards a bit. So some of you probably attended it a few weeks ago. It was very much a propaganda mission. Countries open for business, huge potential, which of course it has. Desperate for foreign investment, which it is. And yes, there are huge potential areas in Algeria. These are massive. But the gist of it is that, at the moment, those aren't going to happen until they've resolved the political crisis, which is got no further forward down the road, or there are a few indications that it may be moving a little bit, but there are also several that go the other way. It's still very, very open. And Tebboune himself has come out. I was very polite about him, actually. I think I awarded him the Nobel Prize for Economics because he'd come up with solutions that no one has ever heard of. And in my sort of fairly waspy weekly comments, I was very careful to say I couldn't understand what he was talking about, but he was clearly on track for a Nobel Prize here, because from the mess that the economy's in, there'll be zero unemployment, within click your fingers, it's getting rid of that. Growth rates is going to be 300% bigger than IMF and the World Bank are forecasting. Of course, they're just about idiots, so we don't pay attention to them, etc. And this is Tebboune at his very best. And I quite like Tebboune in a funny sort of way. I mean, he's not but he was making all these extraordinary, absurdly optimistic statements. And the way he was going to generate all this economic growth was through startups. Startups in Algeria, 50% of people are in the informal sector. What are you going to start up here? It was sort of Mickey Mouse stuff. Anyhow, it sounded good, and no doubt foreign people would love to hear it. He was really talking in cliches. There was nothing wrong with what he was saying. Yes, sure, diversify the economy, all the right things, but it was just cliches. Everyone's heard them all before. And I think his analysis was really fairly absurd. I think Gerard's statement last week on the new economic plan was a bit more realistic, and this is what he's saying here, saying that what's gone before is basically rubbish, huge damage to the economy. So he's basically saying what everyone knows, and that's good. To have a senior person in administration actually coming out and saying, for once in a while, this was rubbish, that was wrong, they ripped the economy off, they stole money, they're a bunch of criminals, etc., which everyone knows. It's good when the Prime Minister says that. And Tebboune has delegated him more powers than most Prime Ministers have ever had. So I think Gerard is a man to watch. I may be wrong, but he's done okay in the very short time he's been there. He's already binned the budget for last year. That was an absurdity anyhow. And the new one, a new supplementary budget, will come in. I don't know when, he hasn't said. I would imagine probably June, July. It's going to take them a little while to really work things out because the economy is in a mess. But his statements have sounded pragmatic, they sounded positive, whether they are possible to... he talked about the many untapped sectors. And of course, this is why Algeria is such a phenomenal country. There are huge sectors of that economy which are absolutely zero exploited. Tourism. The last figures I have for Spain, south of Spain, years out of date, with 35 million tourists went there a year. Okay, what has South Spain got that's better than what Algeria's got? It's worth thinking about. The coast, the sea, the mountains, the culture, the desert. Algeria actually is one of the great, potentially untapped tourist countries in the world. How many tourists it has? Basically zilch. If you look at the official statistics, it'll tell you there are thousands. That's every dodgy passing, watch my P's and Q's a bit, corrupt trader from the Gulf popping in to manage something or flog something or rip it off, or Tunisians coming over for a bit of fresh air and vice versa. So these figures are ridiculous, make no sense. But in terms of, if you like, Western, richer tourists going to Algeria, the numbers are very, very small, minimal really. And the potential there is absolutely huge. It's going to be difficult to realise, but it's worth just making that comparison between South Spain and Algeria. It's been like that for a long time, but it is a huge untapped sector. And of course, renewables. And I'll come back to those in just a minute. This is a huge sector, and I think John was making some comments about that. Okay. But there's been no indication how any of these projects will be funded. They're talking about, Tebboune in particular, of freeing up some of the projects that have been frozen. Wonderful, great. We'd all like to see them. Everyone would, where's the funding coming from? China, all the dodgy money that's been chucked around at Bouaza, the stuff I was mentioning about, and it will be off in Swiss bank accounts. So there are big questions here which just are not being answered, and they haven't been answered. Will the scrapping of the 5149 investment rule entice foreign investors? Well, I think we have to be a little bit careful about this. Where was that done? Okay, that was legislated in the Loi de Finance for last year. Okay, it's passed, it's approved, and so forth. Not, of course, in strategic areas, so there's ambiguity over what is a strategic area, and that may well be redefined, etc., etc., etc. And as that budget's being slung in the dustbin, and the Prime Minister said it's a load of rubbish anyhow, I think we need to wait and see, firstly, what the new budget is, secondly, whether they will reconfirm this law change, precisely where they see strategic sectors stopping and starting, and all the grey areas in between there. And so there's a bit of an unknown on that. But in theory, yes, of course it will help. But we need, and when this talk came up a month or two ago, I thought, well, I'll talk about that, because one of the first things that's going to happen this year is this. Well, it hasn't. It's sort of kind of shelved, and there's been no discussion of it really in Algeria. Be careful of the propaganda. Everything's open. Just bear in mind that the budget law is going to be rewritten later in the year, and that may give clarification to this. It certainly needs to be clarification. Yeah, and be careful of Tebboune's cliches and stuff there. And the Hydrocarbons Law, will the new Hydrocarbons Law resolve the sector's many problems? I think it's unlikely, because the problems are so deep. They're so deep-rooted. Yes, it favours new investment. It favours foreign oil companies in terms of tax breaks and other inducements. So, yes, it's basically what oil companies have been asking for some time. But given the wider global and local situation, it's too little too late, is my view, insofar as the world is moving it away from hydrocarbons as fast as its legs can carry it. So, are the big majors going to be investing in good old-fashioned hydrocarbons out of Algeria, or are they going to go into renewables and elsewhere? I see a head, shaking here and there and so forth. So again, a little bit, too little, too late sort of thing. So yes, good, but I don't think it's going to revolutionise the industry. Also, there's a need for much clearer direction from the new government, where it's going, precisely who runs the country, and there's a need for political stability with this very uncertain situation. And I think if you draw anything out of what I'm saying, it is very difficult to read what's going to happen. The situation is too uncertain to really to talk very heavily about that. I think on this question of who runs the country, watch this space. I talked about that plotting. Bouaza is an extraordinarily interesting individual in terms of how he has done. Those of you who remember the former intelligence chief, Medien, how he completely ran the country for the best part of 25 years till he came unstuck rather accidentally, rather as Qaid Saleh did. People slip, the banana skins. The banana skin for Qaid Saleh was Kleber, thinking he was going to be clobbered and spieling everything. The banana skin for Medien was in Menas. But the pattern of Bouaza is rather similar, using the pretty filthy means of undermining just about everyone and taking over. A deal was done between Tebboune, Bouaza, Shangria, the head of the Secretary General for the Defence Ministry, and one other general that you haven't heard of for a long time, Ben Ali. And those of you who know Algeria well will think, the name rings a bell. Well, Ben Ali actually is the highest ranking officer in the country, higher than Shangria and so forth. He's still alive. I don't know how good his health is. He was very, very close to Said Bouteflika, so he was kind of ignored by Qaid Saleh, but he was probably too powerful for Qaid Saleh to remove, so he stayed on as head of the Presidential Guard. And he is a name that you just won't have heard of, at least for the last 12 months, 18 months. He's still there. he may well come back into prominence in possibly quite a big way. I'm not sure which, but he still, has the stars and stripes on his shoulder, or the pips on his shoulder, and he's the highest-ranking officer around. So you may hear. They came to some agreement with Bouaza, who was let out of house arrest the day Qaid Salah died, of course, so his house arrest was very brief. As I understand it, agreement was made that, he stays on, heading the intelligence service, and the phrase that stuck in my mind was the warning to him. I don't know who gave him the warning, but probably the group: don't do anything silly. Those were the words translated to me, what came out of that meeting. By don't do anything silly, I take that in my interpretation of it. You've been plotting all year, you've managed to get rid of just about everybody, don't plot against us. So it looks as if there may be a new sort of group of generals forming there. Lashkam, I think, as far as I know, he hasn't been dismissed. He was about to be dismissed, so I'm not quite sure where he stands on this. And there are 2 or 3 others there. So this question of, I think that we're going to hear more, well, we won't hear about it, you've got to dig it out. I think there's going to be more movements going on amongst the generals, probably as a result of Bouaza and his activities. Whether he's learned a lesson, whether this has encouraged him, I don't know. But he is a very crafty, dangerous individual who has been, those plottings I talked about last year, again, if you subscribe to our stuff, it's all the details are in there, and that's the only place you'll be able to read it. And we'll probably say more about it. So this really begs the question of how much freedom Tebboune has to be his own man. If Qaid Salah was still alive, the answer was no, he would just be Qaid Salah's puppet. So on face value, with Qaid Salah's death, maybe this gives Tebboune a bit more power. He will also have just a little bit of leverage over Bouaza, the plotting. Shangri is very ill. I suspect he may fade off the scene in a while. Ben Ali is in the wings. Not the healthiest guy up, but he's there. So there's a few unknowns going on there in the real centre of power, and we need to watch that. Again, subscribe to us. We monitor it pretty every, and I don't think we've really got anything very wrong. Famous last words so far. Touch wood. So a very uncertain situation. I love Algeria. I would love to see it flourish. It's there, huge potential, and it doesn't need much, actually, to pull the levers to get it going, quite frankly. It just needs an admission by the regime that they're finished, their stuff, get on a plane, go to Dubai, all your money's there, no one's going to come and get you back, you're off, go, take your families with you, bring in the second revolution. The Hirak basically is a very reasonable democratic sort of body. The opposition parties in the PAD are pretty sound and so forth. And there's a huge amount of goodwill running right through the country. But it's got to be activated, it's got to be released, and the old guard has to be removed. And that includes most of those generals. So that's where we are. So any questions? Sorry.